Hello, third graders. Here we are. We are nearing the end of our Charlie and the Chocolate Factory story. We are actually going to finish up our last two chapters today. Now, yesterday you watched an Into the Book video on making connections. So while we're reading today, I want you to get out my book of reading graphic organizers. I want you to open it up to the section, the blue section, making connections. Find a clean sheet in there. Write the title of the book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, on the top. And while I'm reading today, I want you to make some connections. Text to self connections. How does this book remind you of yourself or things that you have done? Text to text connections. How does this book remind you of other books that you've read or other movies maybe that you have seen? And text to world. What does this remind you of in the real world? Some things that might happen in the real world. While I'm reading today, I want you to try to come up with one or two ideas for each type of connection. And then when we finish, I will share with you the connections that I made with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Just a reminder, it doesn't have to be just the end of the book. You can think of the entire book while you're trying to make these connections. Okay? So here we go, the final two chapters of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Chapter 29, The Other Children Go Home. We must go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything else, said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button and the elevator dropped lower, and soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates to the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gates. I only see 3, he said. Who's missing? I expect it's Mike TV, Mr. Wonka said. But he'll be coming along soon. Do you see all the trucks? Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. Yes, said Charlie. What are they for? Don't you remember what it said on the golden tickets? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of candy. There's 1 truckload for each of them, loaded to the brim. Aha, Mr. Wonka went on. There goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father. You mean he's really all right? Asked Charlie, astonished. Even after going up that awful pipe? He's very much all right, said Mr. Wonka. He's changed, said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass wall of the elevator. He used to be fat. Now he's as thin as a straw. Of course he's changed, said Mr. Wonka, laughing. He got squeezed into the pipe. Don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet Beauregard, the great gum chewer. It seems as though they managed to dejuice her after all. I'm so glad. And how healthy she looks. Much better than before. But she's purple in the face, cried Grandpa Joe. So she is, said Mr. Wonka. Ah, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Good gracious, cried Charlie. Look at poor Veruca Salt. And Mr. Salt and Mrs. Salt. They're simply covered with garbage. And here comes Mike TV, said Grandpa Joe. Good heavens! What have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and as thin as a wire. They've overstretched him in the gum stretching machine, said Mr. Wonka. How very careless. But how dreadful for him, cried Charlie. Nonsense, said Mr. Wonka. He is very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now, he added, it is time we left these 4 silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie. Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and the elevator swung upwards into the sky. The final chapter, Chapter 30. The great glass elevator was now hovering high over the town. Inside the elevator stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. How I do love my chocolate factory, said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused, and he turned around and looked at Charlie with a most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it, Charlie?" "Oh, yes," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world." "I am very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. "I am very pleased indeed to hear you say that. And now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes, and he said, "You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. "I'm giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him?" gasped Grandpa Joe. "You must be joking." "I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious." But, why would you give your factory to little Charlie?" "Listen," Mr. Wonka said. "I'm an old man, and I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who is going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for a chance to come in and take it over from me, but I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will always try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one to whom I can tell my most precious candy-making secrets to, while I am still alive." "So that is why you sent out the golden tickets," cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one that I liked best, at the end of the day, would be the winner." But Mr. Wonka," stammered Grandpa Joe, "do you really and truly mean that you are giving the whole of this enormous factory to little Charlie? After all, there's no time for arguments," cried Mr. Wonka. "We must go at once and fetch the rest of your family. Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie?" Charlie peered down through the glass elevator at the snow-covered houses that lay below. "It's over there," he said, pointing. "It's the little cottage right on the edge of town. The tiny little one." "I see it," cried Mr. Wonka. And he pressed some more buttons, and the elevator shot down toward the Charlie's house. "I'm afraid my mother won't come with us," Charlie said sadly. "Why ever not?" "Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George." "But they must come too." "They can't," said Charlie. "They're very old, and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. "Then we'll take the bed along as well, with them in it," said Mr. Wonka. "There's plenty of room in this elevator for a bed." "You couldn't get the bed out of the house," said Grandpa Joe. "It won't go through the door." "You mustn't despair," cried Mr. Wonka. "Nothing is impossible. You watch." The elevator was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. "What are you going to do?" cried Charlie. "I'm going right on in to fetch them," said Mr. Wonka. "How?" asked Grandpa Joe. "Through the roof," said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. "No!" shouted Charlie. "Stop!" shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash! The elevator went right through the roof of the house and into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed, and each of them thought that the end of the world has come. Grandma Georgina fainted, Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth, Grandpa George put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. "Save us!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Calm yourself, my darling wife," said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the elevator. It's only us." "Mother," cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. "Mother, Mother, listen to what's happened. We're all going to live back in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him run it, and he's going to give it all to me, and. "What are you talking about?" said Mrs. Bucket. "Just look at our house," cried poor Mr. Bucket. "It's in ruins." "My dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand, "I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again, anyway." "Who is this crazy man?" screamed Grandma Josephine. "He could have killed us all." "This," said Grandpa Joe, "is Mr. Willy Wonka himself." It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day, and even then they all refused to ride back to the factory in the elevator. "I'd rather die in my bed," shouted Grandma Josephine. "So would I," cried Grandma Georgina. "I refuse to go," announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the elevator. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button, the doors closed, Grandma Georgina screamed, and the elevator rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof, out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people who were still petrified with fear. "Please don't be frightened," he said. "It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family is starving." "Anything to eat?" cried Charlie, laughing. "Oh, you just wait and see." The end. There you go, boys and girls. We finally finished the adventures of Charlie, Bucket, and the Chocolate Factory. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed reading it to you. So hopefully while you were reading, you were able to fill out the Making Connections page of your graphic organizer. If you did not get a chance to fill this out yet, I want you to pause the video right now and go and fill this out. And when you have finished filling your graphic organizer out, I want you to come back and I'm going to share with you what connections I made, and we can make some comparisons. So here is my graphic organizer that I filled out after I finished reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the connections that I made throughout the whole story. So I'm going to start with the text to self connections. The very first connection that I made was a pretty easy connection because Charlie loves chocolate, and boys and girls, I've got a sweet tooth too, and whenever there's chocolate around, I have to eat it. So I was able to make that connection with Charlie and his family, with Charlie and the other children in the story. Another connection that I made was, what was I feeling when I read this? Well, in the beginning, I felt really sad for Charlie and his family because they were so poor and they didn't have a lot of money. And oftentimes they went hungry. So that made me feel really bad for them. But in the end, I was really, really happy that the good character, Charlie, won the factory. And now him and his family are all going to be able to live safely in the factory for the rest of their lives. I like it when stories have happy endings like this. The text-to-text connection I made was, this book reminds me of two other books that I have read in the past. One book is called Chocolate Fever, and it's about a child who loves chocolate so much that he ate chocolate, and then eventually he got sick and he got the chocolate fever and he had to try to figure out how to get rid of it. And another story that it reminds me of is Chocolate Touch, was another little boy who liked chocolate so much that eventually everything he started to touch turned to chocolate. And that actually became a pretty big problem for him. So those might be two books that you would be interested in reading too. So Chocolate Fever and Chocolate Touch. And a text to world connection that I made was right now going on in Altoona where we live. There is a golden Easter egg hunt. It's a virtual one because we can't go outside and hunt for it, but it's a golden Easter egg and they give you clues, and that kind of reminds me of when Charlie and all the other kids around the world were looking for the golden ticket. And the final connection that I made is many people, as they grow older, they hand their companies over to somebody younger who can kind of take over and run their company. Kind of how Mr. Willy Wonka knew that he was getting older and he wanted somebody to take over his company, somebody who was young, so he chose Charlie to take over the factory. So boys and girls, those are the connections that I made while we were reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Maybe some of our connections were similar and maybe not, and that's okay. But I hope you all enjoyed reading. And our next read aloud that we are going to read is called, and I should have grabbed it, I'm going to grab it quick. Our next read aloud that we're going to read for the end of the year is called Sideways Stories from Wayside School. And this is kind of a funny book that has lots of different characters and teachers from this crazy school that has lots and lots of stories in it. So when we come back for another read aloud, this is the book we're going to be reading. Okay? So boys and girls, while you continue to read this week, I want you to continue to make connections, text to self connections, text to text connections, and text to world connections. See you later. Bye-bye.